So let's jump all the way back to September 2010. During Photokina, Fuji announced the Finepix X100, and this camera was something new. It was a retro-styled rangefinder digital camera with an APS-C size sensor. And that doesn't sound that exciting in today's camera market, but keep in mind, at that same Photokina, the Canon 60D was announced, and so that kind of gives you an idea of how special this little camera was, because up until that point, Fuji was just making little plastic Finepix point-and-shoot cameras, so to see this cool retro rangefinder metal design, it obviously stole the show, and that's all anyone was talking about. Now back in 2010, 2011, I had a Canon T3i, and I didn't even care that much about camera gear. All I knew is that I wanted a full-frame camera because they were considered professional. And a year later, I bought a used 5D Mark II, and at that point, I kind of considered myself a professional, but I digress. This year actually marks the 10th anniversary of the Fuji X system with the launch of the X Pro 1, and back when this camera finally came out in 2011, it was still under the title of Finepix, not X, even though it has an X in its name, X100. It even says on the bottom, Finepix X100. And so that didn't really come in the next iteration of the X100S, where it kind of landed in the X system, and that was supporting a 16 megapixel X-Trans sensor. So where does the X100 fit in 2022? Well, the camera has slow contrast-based autofocus. The autofocus is 80% wrong most of the time. It has slow menus. It doesn't give you proper exposure preview in manual. It doesn't have an ISO dial. It has poor battery life. The lens is pretty soft wide open. It's got focus by wire manual focus. It's kind of laggy and not responsive. And I literally just made this camera sound like garbage, but what isn't garbage is the image quality, and that's where you're gonna fall in love with this camera. The 12 megapixel sensor really packs a punch, and back when this camera was created, there was no X-Trans sensor. That didn't come till the X Pro 1 in 2012. This camera has an EXR CMOS sensor, which was kind of like paving the way for the X-Trans sensor that came later. There's a lot of info on an X-Trans versus a bare sensor if you want to give it a little Google. But basically it just has a different pixel color array, which is supposed to help with getting sharper images with less moire. And I can't say for sure that's actually true or not, but Fuji does have kind of a slightly different look than other cameras have. But all that said, this camera is special. I paid about $350 for it, and this one's actually in really good shape. And at this point, it's basically a collector's item. It's got a beautiful design, and this design translates across all the X100 line. And I remember the first time I saw an X100 camera in the store, and it looked so cool on the shelf. There was nothing else like it at the time, except maybe a Leica, but the local camera store I went to, they didn't put that kind of royalty on the shelf. And I distinctly remember seeing this and going, man, that's an expensive camera with a fixed lens, And so I just kind of wrote it off as like a rich person's hipster camera because I was all in on Canon DSLRs at the time. Now this camera design has stayed somewhat true all the way through the X100 line, all the way up to the X100V where we are now. And basically on the X100V, they just removed all the buttons. It kind of gives it more of like a Leica look on the back. But I love that this camera has all the buttons. It's got a D-pad and a wheel, but it doesn't have a joystick. So to move the autofocus pointer around, you have to hold down the AF button and move the D-pad. It's kind of annoying, but that's just how they have it set up. But it does have all the useful buttons you need, which is going to keep you out of the menus. And speaking of menus, this menu's pretty primitive. There's not a lot of options, but I was surprised to see crazy things like the ability to adjust your highlight and your shadow tone, as well as the color strength. That's pretty cool because that makes this like a perfect little JPEG machine. Oh, and you also have the option to change the colors in the menu. And this seems like such a Finepix feature, not something you put in the X system, but the menus have kind of like little animations as well, which kind of look like a 2003 DVD player. This camera had a lot of cool features that most cameras didn't have back then, and more specifically, I'm talking about the hybrid viewfinder. I think that was a pretty new thing at the time, and as far as I know, there wasn't anything else like that. And being able to use an optical viewfinder to see your frame with your overlay was pretty cool. There was also an autofocus confirmation box when you got your focus correct, but you could also switch the lever on the front and then switch it over into EVF mode, and then you had an electronic viewfinder. The EVF in this camera is not great, and neither is the LCD screen, to be honest, but like I said, this was kind of a first of its kind, so we got to kind of give it a pass there. It also has a built-in ND filter, and I don't know many cameras that have built-in ND filters other than the Fuji X100 line or Sony's RX100 line. And the reason for this ND filter is because it only goes up to 1/4000th of a second shutter, and if you want to keep the lens wide open in a bright scene, you might need to use that ND filter. And the shutter in this camera is actually a leaf shutter, and all the X100 cameras have leaf shutters. And the leaf shutter is really quiet, which is amazing for street photography, and some other advantages other than just being quiet is that it's more compact, and you also have the ability to shoot flash at any shutter speed without any sync issues. And because it's not like a typical focal plane shutter, you also don't have issues with rolling shutter. Now I mentioned this camera does have a 12 megapixel sensor and image quality is pretty good. And the sensor that's in this camera for the time that it was created is actually still pretty solid today. You know, I've only had the camera for about 5 months, so I haven't had a ton of use with it, but all the shots that I've taken have impressed me. You know, the color, the detail, the overall look of the images, they just have a vibe to them that you can't create from anything else. It just has a look to it. They also have a few film simulations, which is pretty cool. I don't think there was anything at the time like that. And so when you shoot JPEG, you're gonna get something close to their popular film stocks. They didn't include a lot of them though. There was only Provia, Velvia, Astia, Monochrome, and of course Sepia, which is more like a filter. It wasn't until the X100T that they added Classic Chrome, which is probably my favorite film simulation. But if you use my Classic Ports presets on these raw files, you can get something pretty close to the look of Classic Chrome. I've been using GearFocus now for a couple years, and it's honestly the best place to buy and sell used camera gear. So if you're looking to sell your used camera gear, GearFocus is a good place to start because it's specifically focused on camera gear, and that's what you want compared to other marketplaces that just have everything. And it also makes it awesome for you if you're trying to buy something too. If you're trying to look for a new camera or lens, you might actually find a better deal on something used. So once you've set up an account with GearFocus, you can start listing your items right away, but you need to make sure you take some good quality images of the actual item you're selling so the buyer knows what they're getting into. And the cool thing is with GearFocus, you can actually communicate. The buyer and seller can message each other, ask more questions, or the buyer can actually make an offer on the item as well. I've actually sold a ton of stuff on there now, and it's been great not having the hassle of trying to sell stuff in person. I currently put up some new stuff, so make sure to check that out if you're browsing GearFocus. GearFocus handles all the transaction and money side of things, so you know you're safe compared to selling stuff in person. GearFocus only takes a small 3.5% transaction fee, which is way better than eBay because eBay has insanely high fees now. So make sure to check out my shop at gearfocus.com. The link is in the description. Rolling right along, I haven't really mentioned the lens yet. You know, this camera does have a fixed 23mm f2 lens, which is kind of a standard 35mm full frame equivalent. All the generations of the X100 have this lens, but you know, this is the first generation, so it has a few flaws. This lens is extremely soft at f2, and especially if you're shooting anything close up. And what's cool is this camera actually has a macro button, which limits the autofocus to a closer focus, so the focus is a little bit quicker. That said, you're not going to be shooting true macro with this camera. You get about 4 to 5 inches of minimum focus distance. The lens looks the best at f5.6 to f8, and you know, most street photography you're going to be shooting at that anyway, so it's pretty good for that. But I found that if you want some like soft, dreamy look, it's pretty cool to shoot this at f2. It kind of looks like a strong pro mist, but you know, it's not going to be super crispy at f2 compared to, you know, the newer X100V, which has a massively improved lens, and it shoots amazing wide open. Compared to this, there really isn't even a difference. So coming back to the autofocus is pretty awful, and I think the worst part is when it's focusing, the screen actually freezes until it actually finds the focus, which is usually wrong most of the time. So I'd recommend just manually focusing the camera. It does kind of have, you know, like a first version focus peaking, which does help with manual focus. It basically just kind of super sharp outlines what's in focus. And you know, that's gonna help you out when you're manually focusing. I think that if you're looking for some nostalgia, try and pick one of these up. Try and find one of these older cameras, maybe an X100S. You're gonna have a lot of fun shooting with it, you know, and it's still got a beautiful design. And this camera's gonna produce images with a vibe that you can't really get straight out of camera from something else. And you know, yes, it's slow and clunky, but I like it, and it's kind of fun. That's the fun of using it. It's kind of slowing you down. It's kind of like shooting film. Anyway, let me know if you have an older OG X100 or any of the X100s that came after it. I think that if you can find this camera in good shape for a good price, it's probably worth grabbing. You know, it's even just as a collector's item. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you want me to review some older cameras. I don't know, maybe I can review some older camera gear. And thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike this video, give it a thumbs down twice. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thumbnail. Oh, I gotta put the camera in focus first. I don't make thumbnails like that.